Let's talk about the pairing wine.
A lot of people talk about pairing wine in terms of complementary pairings versus contrasting pairings. And so complementary pairings would be instances where there might be a particular sort of chord of flavor in a dish that you can mimic with the wine in some way. Contrasting pairings tend to be a little bit more textural. I'm all about contrasting pairings and using the wine as a kind of a reagent, if you will, like sort of. So acid, for example, cuts fat. Long time ago, I always use this example. There was a dishwashing liquid called palm olive, and they had a character. You know how like there was the Mr. Whipple with the Charmin? Don't squeeze the Charmin. You
I
probably
guess
don't.
I'm
I'm
sure
not.
the listeners know I'm yeah.
So Mr. Whipple was this character that they created to sell this brand of toilet paper that was really soft. And so he would get mad at the customers in the store if they squeezed toilet paper because it was going to ruin the softness of the toilet paper. Okay. So he was like a whole guy, right? So similarly, Palmolive created a diner waitress named Madge who oversaw the dishwashing, I guess, in the diner. And so she swore by Palmolive because it got the best, it had the best grease cutting capabilities, right? So one of the times they added lemon to Palmolive because lemon juice cuts fat, right? And when they
Mhm.
put the Palmolive in the greasy thing with all the plates in it, all the grease went like that, like sort of went away.
I
And
saw it.
so,
Yep.
so you use the wine, to me, using the acidity in wine to kind of cleanse your palate and be a foil for fatty food is number one. That's kind of the most basic, and it's oftentimes overlooked by people. For example, a lot of people say with wine pairing, you should match the scale of the dish with the scale of the wine. So you get this big ribeye steak, and I don't know, maybe it's covered in like mushrooms, or it's like it's got a over polenta with all the sauce on top, or something kind of. So I want to serve this huge wine with it, and a lot of times
What do you mean huge wine? Can you
like
elaborate?
really full bodied, really like sort of heavy, maybe high alcohol, with a
Like
long
Cabernet or what was it? Syrah? What is it?
Cabernet Sauvignon. Yeah, sure. Usually it's like Cabernet and steak, right? But a
Hmm.
lot of times with a lot of these Cabernets, they're so ripe tasting, they're so fruity. They're so constant, they have so much fruit concentration that to me it's like spreading jelly on your steak. I don't want I'd rather have something that was more earthy and savory and picks up on the bloodiness of the steak and has some acidity that kind of cuts into it, like a Chianti from Tuscany, a Barbera from Piedmont, or any wine with a little more acidity, a little less of that heavy duty fruit. There's wines to be tasted in a panel and decide which one's the best, and there's wines to eat with food or drink with food, and they are two totally different wines. And when you're dealing with wines that have this big scores and everything like that, those are like show wines. They're like wines that are being assessed in a vacuum. They're humongous. And when I was with the Wine and Spirits magazine, we had panel tastings. You're talking 40 Cabernets from Napa Valley in one shot. They come out in waves, but you're sitting there with a bunch of other people and you're going to taste through 40, 15% alcohol Cabernet Sauvignons. Which one's going to stand out in a blind tasting? It's going to be the biggest one, right?
Yep.
Sweetest one, the most drink, the most satisfying, right? The ones that are kind of tart and they're not really like giving you much love. You don't have any contact. You're it's side by side, so you have that context, but you're not using it in the way that you're supposed to use wine, which is as a beverage to have with your meal, right? So you're drinking these wines in this like very sterile vacuum, and you're making these decisions, and ultimately the biggest wine is going to win. Not to mention, kind of weigh you down. So like you're halfway through your steak and you're hammered, um, kind of just feeling it's like lots of alcohol, you're like flush, you have like a heart attack, you're like Diamond Jim Brady, you kind of fall over at the table into your soup, it's just like it's too much. So I know that's been big with me as I've gotten older. It's like my palate has gotten a lot lighter.
We spoke a little bit about steaks and what goes with steaks. But what about the
Well,
some
I
other
mean,
food?
there's some classic things that may sound cliche, but it's true. I mean, generally speaking, white wines tend to work better with fish, for a variety of reasons. I mean, one of the things that white wine does not have that red wine does is tannin. So tannins in red wine tend to create that drying effect. I typically find that in addition to the flavors not being complementary, the texture is often not complementary either. It often makes, to me, red wines often make a lot of fish taste kind of metallic because of the presence of tannins. Tannins are more perceived on like kind of your tongue, like almost like the drying of your tongue and the drying of your palate in general, kind of like oversteeped tea gives you that bitter drying effect. Whereas acidity ignites the salivary response. When a wine is high in acidity, it's causing you to salivate. The notable exception would be salmon, for example, which is a little richer fish, a little deeper. It's often cooked either over like sort of wood
Mhm.
fired is
Yep.
very popular. And so some of the smokiness that you get in salmon and some of those deeper flavors can be really great with Pinot Noir, for example, which is but that's a much lighter red with a lot less tannin than say Cabernet Sauvignon, for example. And so it's a little more delicate. There's lots of great red wine and fish pairings out there, but generally speaking, I tend to prefer white. I tend to prefer, generally speaking, with pairing with food, wines that aren't that aggressive in terms of their aromatics and like, well, I shouldn't say that because like Riesling, for example, from Germany, especially some Rieslings where there's a little bit of residual sweetness in the wine are magical with spicy Asian cuisines, Thai, Chinese, whatever subset of Chinese you're in, where you have a wine that is a lot of those German Rieslings, for example, are very low in alcohol. Alcohol and tannin are going to exaggerate spice in food. They make it hotter.
Mm.
That's why I wouldn't pair a really big, powerful Cabernet Sauvignon
With
with
Thai food, yeah,
Thai
makes
food
sense.
because it's just going to make my mouth like on fire, right?
Mm.
It's going to exaggerate the spiciness. It's going to exaggerate the heat of the alcohol. Whereas 10% alcohol or less German Riesling with a touch of residual sweetness to boot, it's like a hand in a glove. And there also happen to be whether it's, I don't know, cilantro or scallions or some of the seasonings that have there are some kindred qualities in the wine, coriander, things like that you may detect in the aromatics and flavors of the wine sometimes. So there's a little bit of complementary, but mostly it's contrasting. This wine is low alcohol. It has a little touch of sweetness. And then this spice comes in and they meet each other in the middle and they kind of cancel each other out and it kind of cleans up. And then there are some complementary aromatic components going on. But ultimately, like a lot of times with pairing, it's often what the dish kind of like what the side dish is that'll drive the pairing more so than what that sort of central protein is on the plate. It's a braised short rib. Okay. Those are easy because it's like, first of all, those are cooked in red wine usually anyway, right? So it's like a braised short rib cooked in red wine, pair it with a big red wine, easy. But what if it comes with like a bunch of horseradish on top? And then there's a side dish of, I don't know, sauteed broccoli rabe or something like that. Like it throws it
David,
all.
just when people thought they start understanding how to pair it, you threw another curveball.
Yeah, you got to throw a curveball. Like here's a classic one. A really classic pairing is Barolo wine, which is a very earthy, spicy. Even when it's young, you get a lot of savor in this red wine. It smells a little bit like leather and antique furniture and mushrooms and all sorts of stuff. And people love to pair it with a very traditional pasta in Piedmont that's just tagliatelle, a fresh, very heavily, like very eggy dough, so it has that really deep color. Fresh, like tallarin, which is like a long, thin ribbon with butter and truffles, white truffles shaved on the top. And
Mm.
they're very, very aromatic and they meld really well for each other. But you know what melds even better in my mind is a white wine that's been aged in oak. Like they feel like, because it's like a little bit buttery, it's a little bit creamy. It picks up on the butter. It picks up on so there's a lot of different ways to skin the cat. And ultimately it comes down to, I do think that rule of scale is a good one, except that I generally want the wine to be a little lighter than the food. I don't want to go head. I don't want to meet it head on, and I want to have wines with acidity, not
Mhm.
fat, sweet, high alcohol wines. I want crisp wines that have lift, hopefully not too much tannin, not too much oak. Generally speaking, I want the wine to be the submissive one in the partnership. People don't like that because it's like, well, I paid a $200 for this bottle of wine. It ain't going to be submissive. You know what I mean? But in in most of the, like half the time, the best wines for pairing with food are simple ones, like muscadet and oysters. The muscadet, I mean, yeah, it's got good flavor, but it's really ultimately it's like a little bit of saltiness, a little bit of creaminess because they age the wine on its yeast, so it takes on a little creamy quality. The fruit is very muted. It's not like a super fruity, pineapple-y ripe kind of wine. It's very dry and crisp. It just cleanses. You have an oyster, maybe a little mignonette, same level of acidity as the oyster and the mignonette, and a little bit of saltiness, and just clean. The wine is like the Zamboni that comes onto the ice after the hockey period and cleans it and makes it smooth again,
Mhm.
and kind of corrects what's going on in your mouth. So like the acidity a lot of times is going to correct a palate that's coated in fat and kind of recalibrate everything that's going on, like all the sort of kind of chemical reactions that are going on in your mouth as you're chewing food and drinking wine. Like the wine is like a corrective and readying you for another bite of food. Sounds crazy, but it kind of is happening.